Welcome. It is July 7th, and welcome to the next episode of the Virtual Cafe. My guest today is Lauren Rikleen. She is an attorney and an author. I'm so lucky to have her as a champion of mine for many, many years. She has written some fascinating books, and her most recent book is about bullying in the workplace, and we've had a lot of conversations around that topic, and also people being bystanders and being silent, and what is the culture of silence? Why don't we speak up? Actually, one of my favorite shows I like to watch, it's the John Quinones show. I'm forgetting the name of it, but when they have hidden cameras and they stage these experiences, and then somebody bravely raises their hands and says, wait a minute, why are you behaving that way? It's always a remarkable show. So Lauren, thank you so much for being my guest today. And I would like to start out with saying, what was the inspiration, or why did you decide to get into this topic?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me, and it's always a pleasure to do anything with you, and I so admire your ability to connect people far and wide, so this is a treat for me as well. This topic is something that has been almost a part of me for my entire life. I think I'm one of those kids that never accepted the concept of a tattletale. I never liked that word. When somebody told the teacher when something bad was happening or someone was treating somebody meanly, I tended to be the one that would intervene or do something when I saw somebody else being bullied or hurt as a child. So that's just something that's been very ingrained in me. And of course, as I became a professional in the workplace, and I practiced law for a very long time before I started doing the work that I'm doing now, doing speaking and training and consulting on these workplace culture issues, but I was an equity partner in a law firm, experiencing being the first or the only at the table in so many ways, in so many settings. I really got obsessed with this notion of how do you create a culture where people can respect each other? Why is it that we allow people to treat each other poorly in the workplace? Why do we only focus on things, for example, that may be legally actionable, as opposed to the whole host of other kinds of behaviors that can make people miserable at any given point in time? And why does nobody speak up about it? So on a personal level, I've had to make those kind of decisions and choices throughout my career about speaking up, using my voice, intervening. And on a professional level, it became something that really was important to me to write about and think about and focus on whenever I could. And I think that the topic itself really infuses so much of my writing throughout, most of the books that I have written, because I think that in order to really make change in the workplace, in order to address any of the issues we're talking about now with respect to racism, other unconscious bias, conscious bias, different kinds of stereotyping, misconduct, sexual harassment, just bad behavior, we have to focus on workplace culture. We have to empower people to be able to respond to negativity when we are, in our personal lives as well as when we're in the workplace.
Is there any change you're seeing with remote culture right now? Is there more bullying, less bullying? Are you hearing anything now that we're all locked in and sequestered?
I actually have not heard a ton. What I hear about is, what will it be like when we go back? I hear more worry being expressed about, with people so preoccupied with what has happened to us nationally with the impacts of the coronavirus and all that it has done to affect our day-to-day lives at work. What I continually hear about is, when we do go back into the workplace, will anybody care about these issues anymore? So I hear more about that than I do anything necessarily changing or happening as a result of meetings and conversations through Zoom.
What are some 2 to 3 action steps? You're witnessing something. I don't know. Maybe at some point we'll be in restaurants again. I don't know. Or, or you're at an airport, or, these are places we aren't right now. But I'd like for us to think about what are some things that we can do and have that we can be prepared for. Mm-hmm. 1, and 2, what are some either talking points or action items? I find myself sometimes speaking up, and other times I don't speak up and I regret it. I wish I had added voice to that, but I'm also, frankly, at times, why do I always have to be the one who speaks up? Any answer to that question? Why does it always have to be me who stop?
So I totally understand that question and that feeling of why aren't other people intervening here? And that is why actually, and you and I, we've been connected a long time, but we connected about today because you had saw my information about the bystander intervention training course that I had developed. And the reason that I developed that is because workplace as a society, we don't sufficiently focus on what does it mean to be a bystander, and understand that if you are a bystander or witness to some kind of misconduct or harm or hurt to somebody else, you are not simply staying out. You are providing the fuel for the behavior to continue to ignite. You're not simply there's no such thing as an innocent bystander. If you are a bystander who's afraid to speak out, you are empowering the perpetrator in some ways. You are probably, according to the research, causing harm to yourself, because there's all kinds of really interesting research emerging around impacts to bystanders who don't speak up about the guilt that they deal with, the depression they may feel from what they're witnessing, worrying about are they next. So there's all kinds of research that shows that being a non-intervening bystander is harmful in the workplace setting, both to the workplace and to you individually. So then the question is, understand then that being passive does not mean you're not really being active and having a role. And then the next level of analysis has to be, how do I respond safely? What do I have to do in this circumstance? And a part of that is recognizing there is no one size fits all. So there's no magic answer like, well, if you see this, do that. Or, if this happens, then all you have to do is X, Y, or Z. Every circumstance is different, and every circumstance will require you to say, what's happening here? Is it an emergency? What level of problem is it? And what are my options for intervention? Is it something where if I make a joke to get somebody off track or move the conversation in a different direction, that will work? Is it something where I should be trying to get a victim away from the behavior or the conduct, literally physical, being a physical intervention? Does it warrant my perhaps having to be silent in this moment, but immediately either reporting the behavior or going into that individual to talk about what you observed and how you can respond? There are different levels for the analysis, but it requires understanding what the circumstances are and recognizing that most times you do have more power than you give yourself credit for. And one of the other interesting things in the research about this is that a lot of times bystanders don't intervene because more out of embarrassment. They're afraid of looking bad. They're afraid of doing something that's awkward or stupid or other people making fun of them. So getting past that level of inhibition is also quite important, so that you feel that, okay, this is not about me or how I'm going to look. This is about how I can help this person in the moment.
So you're in an office setting, virtually or in person, and you witness something that makes you uncomfortable. What's an opening? Is it, I feel uncomfortable because I watched that, or excuse me, you're an idiot? I'm assuming that's not the best way to start this conversation. What's a good way to open that?
Again, it's always going to be contextual. The question is, first of all, are you safe? Is the person being victimized safe? That's always the most critical analysis. And if the answer to that is yes, then the question, it's almost like you're doing this quick thin slicing in your own brain about what of these circumstances, who's the perpetrator, and what will work best within this moment. So I've done interviews or conversations with people about their circumstances or things that have worked for them. They've talked about instances, for example, at a work-related dinner where somebody was being made to feel physically uncomfortable by a client who was being too suggestive and a little too hands-on. And when her coworkers realized it, they very quickly did a little strategy of getting her out of that circumstance. I've had other conversations with people who in the moment were able to use humor to deflect it. Were able to make a wisecrack that broke up the moment and moved the conversation out. Sometimes, though, you can be witnessing something much more direct in terms of bullying, and that may be something in which you may be at risk in your workplace, and you have to figure out a strategy for, is there someone you can report to? Do you have allies in the workplace to whom you can reach out? And again, as I said, it's so very contextual, but the reason why thinking about bystander intervention and being prepared for it is if you understand, okay, there are a menu of strategies, there are a menu of problems that arise. Here's what the research tells me about, what is the bystander effect and how does that impact how I behave? What happens in an emergency? If you've already thought through a lot of that, then every time you're in a situation, you're more comfortable being able to respond in some way.
I feel at times when I've witnessed something, I feel a little traumatized myself. And how do I regroup on that? So obviously, one of the things that I think most of us witnessed, if you will, or were bystanders, was the situation in Minneapolis. How do you handle it when a bunch of people are with their cameras and they're videoing it, and you're assuming that there's somebody in charge? I mean, in a perfect world, I imagine myself being a little child walking up to that policeman saying, can you let him breathe? But
in fact, that was happening. I mean, that's the part, among the layers of tragedy in that circumstances, there were many, I think bystanders did all but tackle those police officers. And since there were 4 of them with guns, I don't criticize any of them, but they certainly begged, pleaded, yelled at, videoed. God willing, none of us are going to have that kind of circumstance in our life, that we are directly witnessing someone being murdered in that context. The flip side of that, on the other end of the scale, for example, could be the Amy Cooper story of who 24 hours before George Floyd was murdered, she was in Central Park using her white privilege to call the police because a Black male bird watcher asked her to leash her dog in a park in which dogs were not supposed to be unleashed. Here, the video saved the day because by having somebody, well, in this case, it was a gentleman bird watcher who filmed her response and her call to the police. It showed that what he was doing was non-threatening, and what she was doing was in effect, and according to yesterday's charge by the Manhattan District Attorney, likely illegal. So that's a circumstance where video was helpful. And we are seeing now in this period that we're in the last month or two, the importance of videotaping, actually. I wrote an article that just came out a couple of days ago in which part of what I said is, we should all be living as though we are being videotaped all the time. And in fact, so many of the things we're witnessing are being videotaped. And I don't see any reason not to use that as part of your power, part of your opportunity to intervene. That phone is with you for a reason. And when you're in circumstances where you might not be able to do something else, at least you have a record of it that you can use in the future.
Yeah, I mean, that to the Central Park story continues to be a story. I read about it yesterday as well. It was interesting, when they took her dog back, it had layers and layers of issues. And I thought the gentleman was very calm in his recording of it. And as you said, we wouldn't know any of that story if he had not been doing his own recording. Mm-hmm. How can we self-advocate when we're a victim, when maybe there aren't people around? What are some things that we can do in that moment of silence or that solitude that we can do? Let's put the context that we're not physically in danger and there's a verbal situation or there's something that's uncomfortable. Let's just assume the physical part is there's no guns and we're not in a life-threatening. How can we deal with something in that situation?
I'm going to just step back from that question a tiny bit to say this. Every workplace has the responsibility and ought to be held accountable for making sure they have in place the structures and the policies that help victims through these situations, policies around reporting and ensuring that there's not retaliation of any sort, not just firing, but all kinds of other negative things that can happen as a result of a reporting, a system for feedback and helping people through the process. So I always start from the position that when we are particularly talking about the workplace, the number one responsibility is for leadership to make sure that they put in place the structures and the policies and the procedures that promote and facilitate people responding in a respectful way. Having said that, when you are the victim, the first question I always ask is, of course, do you have a policy where you're able to go forward and through a process? And if not, think about, okay, well, what power do you have in this particular circumstance? People tend to underestimate their own power. They underestimate their power in the workplace, their power to respond, and we all have more power than we think we have. So think about what dynamic are you bringing in this situation? Think about, do you have allies? Are there other people that you can go to who can be helpful and supportive and guide you through a process? So again, there's never a one-size-fits-all answer, but hopefully there's a process in place that can help you. But absent that, think about what power you have to respond, who is the perpetrator, what your options are in that moment, and do you have colleagues that can be allies for you as well?
Can you talk about non-work situations? And oddly enough, the one that's popping in my mind is that we have bullies in my apartment building who refuse to wear masks.
Oh my God.
And we have a policy of only one person in the elevator. When this guy tried to get in the elevator and I said no, he was, well, you act like you're from Texas. And I'm like, well, I don't know about that, but you're not getting in the elevator me without a mask. And we have a pretty ineffective management company. We speak up and then you go to the board meetings and that is a bullying lab. People just being mean and mean and mean. What do you do in a situation where there's really no leadership? It's a free-for-all.
With respect to your particular question, that's a little more layered because we're also talking about the intersection of government policy, what requirements are in the workplace or in your residential environment, who's enforcing that. You have a structure. And it sounds like nobody's following that structure. So the couple of things that emerge are, where can you report? Who can you report to? How many allies do you have in your complex who can band with you in response? In terms of the whole mask issue, that's become the new Wild West, sadly enough. And I think in this state, we've had actually less, for the most part, overall experience on the negative side, but we see these videos that are coming from all over the country where people are throwing their carts around in supermarkets and otherwise screaming and carrying on because somebody asked them to wear a mask. But in those cases, what we're seeing are people intervening through video and people who are intervening in the moment as well. People have gotten fired from how they've responded in these circumstances when they've gone a little inappropriately berserk on people who ask them to wear a mask. So in that case, this notion of videotaping and revealing and exposing this kind of bad behavior has had some progress. But I think, again, in your situation, part of the question is you need a strategy with your group of other people, and I would suspect and hope that those who support what the policy is and the requirements are outweigh those who are not complying, and then you have to figure out what the process is for dealing with that. It always makes sense to ask somebody to please wear a mask. People who tend to take it as a political statement generally are not going to respond to being yelled at or criticized. That's another part of thinking through what strategy can you bring to this. I would hope that there would be some mechanism through which allies working together in the process and structure that you have in the building could be able to prevail at some point.
Yeah, I'm hopeful. I think as we start repopulating into buildings and more people are in elevators, and our guest a few weeks ago was Dave McGilvery, who's the race director for the Boston Marathon. And he said if they were going to socially distance at the start line, it would be 39 miles long.
Right. That was amazing.
He was our guest before the marathon formally canceled. One or two more questions. We're about the same age. Did you think we would still be having this conversation when we were in our 20s and 30s? And how do you stay hopeful when I just really thought this conversation would not be part of my life in the back nine?
I think about that all the time in the writing that I do and the work that I do, and reflect back on they are identical conversations. And sometimes I'll read things by young women in professional journals or other contexts in which I'm thinking to myself, I wrote that article only it was 30 years ago. That is discouraging. And I try to always be a glass more than half full kind of person. But I do feel that, and of course, we've made significant gains in so many ways, but the reality is we haven't made nearly the gains that we should have. I do take some comfort, some hope in the fact that we are in a moment right now where the extent to which institutional racism in our country has had such a tremendous horrible impact, and we're seeing that play out in the streets and play out in so many other ways. So I'm hopeful that that will lead to something that speaks of real change. My feeling is as long as we have life and breath, we have to keep up the good fight and keep moving forward. One of the things I've always said, however, is that one of the reasons why change hasn't been made is because people only want to do not people, but the workplace, for example, is using that as the structure, tends to want to do all the easy things, but postpones or doesn't accept the idea that you really have to do the hard things to make change. You can have great websites and have lovely words and a great affinity group, and you can do all those kinds of things. But if you are not measuring what people are paid and looking at pay inequities and looking at who gets what kind of opportunities and holding people accountable, you're not putting in place the harder things that make people uncomfortable, then we will still be having these conversations next generation 30 years from now. But if we can start to grapple with the difficult, then I'm hopeful there can be some positive change.
I don't know if he's on, but somebody wrote me yesterday and said, would you mind if my 15-year-old son joined the conversation? And I just thought it was just wonderful, because I thought the more we can get teenagers and men, after the interview of Dave McGilvery, I posted it and I said, a few good men. We just need more good men, and we need men who speak up. What are some things that you could leave us with? Any thoughts that you can leave us with as we kind of wind down this conversation? Lauren, what are some things that you can leave us with that we can move forward with this?
One of the reasons why I write a lot about generational issues in the workplace, and I think part of it is because I feel that younger generations are also victims of stereotyping. And another part of it is I think it kind of nurtures me somewhat and gives me hope. I do see optimism for change when you look at who's out there in the streets today. I mean, it's a wonderful mosaic of different generations, all kinds of differences that can give us cause for hope. And I feel that younger generations are hopefully waking up to the kinds of biases that so many others maybe have become accustomed to or accepting of, and question things more. I'm just hopeful that we will see that will make a material difference going forward. I always say when I'm doing any kind of programming in a workplace, I will always say to leaders and managers, you have to be thinking about your institutional sustainability model. And if on the one hand, you keep talking about young people leaving your workplace in large numbers, maybe they're leaving for a reason, because most people will stay loyal and engaged and involved if you give them a reason to. But if you cannot retain an entire generation of people, what does that mean for the organization that you've spent a lifetime helping to create and build? So my hope and my optimism is with the next generations of people who are showing such great enthusiasm for change right now.
It's interesting you say that. I got a call from an executive and he said, "You do executive coaching, right?" And I said, "Yes." And he said, he explained that he had a white male executive who was 50, late 50s. The younger population, particularly the women, were walking out. I mean, they were really uncomfortable a couple of times in different situations. So I sat down with this gentleman and he wasn't particularly threatening in a physical way. So I thought, what's going on? Was it his anger, his temper, and blah, 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 blah. And it was an interesting situation because actually I talked myself out of a coaching situation because it became clear with the pattern that it was really a therapy issue because he had been bullied. Clearly, there was something going on. And I don't do past because that's a therapist and I am not trained, counseled, licensed for any of that sort of stuff. But that's a hard conversation in some cases to have. And the executive thanked me, the president thanked me of this institution, the executive thanked me, and apparently things have turned around quite well. What are some things that they should think about if they're hiring outside counsel? If they've been bullied, at what point do they bring in attorneys and at what point do they really think about how to set that tone? Can you talk maybe about those two things?
You mean hiring outside counsel for oneself to bring an action against their organization?
Yeah. I'm assuming that's what the question is. If you feel you've been wronged, how do you find that person and what's the best way to find that?
Important thing I think about who you hire for outside counsel is some level of trust and comfort that this is a person that understands who you are and who can help work with the kind of strategy that you want to have. And oftentimes when it doesn't work, it's usually because there's a disconnect between your goals and maybe what a lawyer might say, no, we have to do this, and that. But in these kinds of sensitive matters, you want somebody tuned into you and your sensitivities, whatever they may be, whether it's a full-out litigation strategy or something quieter. The best way always to find any professional is through word of mouth and through your own networks, asking people to ask other people. There are plenty of wonderful lawyers out there who can help you. I also would encourage that because I do think too frequently, one of the things that troubles me when I'm talking to people in these circumstances is they'll say, I consulted a lawyer and they told me there's nothing they can do, or I shouldn't do anything, or, women always lose, or some other discouraging thing. And I'm always too much of an optimist to accept that as an answer. Yes, it may be a hard road, but I never accept there's nothing you can do. I never accept that there's no way that you can be helped. Finding the right person who can be in tune with the kind of strategy or goals that you might have in a given situation is a good thing, and not to be afraid to consult with a lawyer. I mean, one of the things we are seeing today that we didn't see 10 years ago, or certainly 25 years ago, is far more litigation against workplaces around issues of workplace behavior. I think that's a good thing. I think it's the equivalent of the video camera, shining a lens on behaviors that need to be addressed.
Lauren, thank you so much again for all your time. And we will send everybody your contact information in case anybody wants to learn more about your work or your workshops or your book. Thank you again so much for all of that.